Somewhere in the human story, there is a strange kind of loss that is more frightening than death. It is the moment when a place becomes so powerful in the mind that people keep walking toward it, even when the forest, the maps, and the silence give nothing back. Perhaps the real mystery is not only whether the city existed, but why the idea of it could outlive the people who searched for it. So what was the lost city that swallowed every explorer who searched for it? Before anyone could prove that it was there, the lost city had already begun to exist in a more dangerous place, inside the human mind. It appeared first not as walls rising above the trees, but as a possibility drawn at the edge of a map, a rumour carried between languages, a mark in a notebook, a line in a letter sent from far away. That is how many lost places begin. They do not begin with stone, they begin with absence. A blank space asks to be filled, and the mind, which evolved to search for paths, water, shelter, and signs of other people, does not like a blank space to remain silent. In the Amazon, that silence could feel almost physical. The rivers bent through distances too wide for easy measure. Forest covered forest, leaf over leaf, root over root, until the ground itself seemed to hide its own memory. To an outsider looking in, the green world could appear endless, but for human beings who had lived there across many generations, it was never empty. It was home, travel route, hunting ground, garden, burial place, and remembered territory. The mistake came when distant observers confused what they could not read with what had never been written. Somewhere between those two visions, the story of the lost city grew. It was not simply a dream of treasure. It was the colder idea that a whole human world might have stood there, worked there, raised children there, changed the soil beneath its feet, and then passed out of ordinary memory so completely that only fragments remained. A city like that did not need to shine. It only needed to be possible. And possibility can be stronger than evidence when evidence is still buried, drowned, overgrown, or misunderstood. The people who went searching were not walking only toward ruins. They were walking toward a question older than maps. How much of the human past can disappear without truly vanishing? Every human group begins with the same fragile needs, the same biological body moving through heat, hunger, fear, fatigue, and hope. Yet over time, bodies become families, families become paths, paths become settlements, and settlements become traces that later strangers may fail to recognize. A broken pot, a dark patch of enriched earth, a straight line where nature usually bends, a story told beside a river, each one can be small by itself. Together they suggest that human life often leaves quiet signatures, not always monuments. This matters because the lost city was never only about one destination. It was about the tension between what people wanted to find and what the forest allowed them to see. The Amazon does not reveal the past in the same way as a dry desert or a stone temple field. It softens edges, it covers shapes, it returns wood to soil, paths to vegetation, and human certainty to doubt. In that kind of world, a searcher could be defeated long before reaching any final place. The body tires, supplies shrink, directions become less certain, the mind begins to bargain with signs. A bend in the river feels meaningful, a mound looks deliberate. A story heard days earlier becomes a guide, then a promise, then perhaps a trap created by expectation itself. This is why the title speaks with such force. The city may not have swallowed people like a living creature. That would be too simple and too easy. More quietly, it may have swallowed them as an idea, pulling them deeper into a landscape where human curiosity met its oldest limit. The first humans survived because they followed clues, but the same gift can lead us beyond what we can safely know. Here, at the edge of a map and a forest, the story begins with a place no one could clearly hold, and with a question that refused to stay still for long. The forest was never a simple curtain hiding a city behind it. It was the condition that shaped every step toward the idea of one. To move through the Amazon was to enter a world where distance did not behave like distance on paper. A line on a map could look short, but on the ground it became mud, heat, insects, flooded banks, fallen trunks, and hours of walking that seemed to return the body to the same wall of green. Rivers offered passage, yet they also decided the terms of travel. They widened, branched, changed speeds, swallowed landmarks, and carried a traveller deeper while making return feel less certain. For anyone searching from outside, the forest could make knowledge arrive slowly, or not at all. It did not need to attack like an enemy. It only needed to remain itself. That is one reason the story of the lost city has to be held carefully. When people say a place swallowed explorers, the easier image is a dramatic one, a hidden ruin, a final camp, a sudden end. But in real landscapes, disappearance is often made from smaller things. A fever that weakens judgment, a canoe delayed by water levels, food that spoils, a path that seems clear in the morning and is unreadable by evening, a guide who turns back because the risk has changed, a message that never reaches the people waiting at home. The human body, which began its long history by learning to read weather, animal movement, plants, and the presence of other groups, is still a fragile instrument. It can walk, remember, compare, and imagine, but it must also drink, rest, cool itself, heal, and remain oriented. In the Amazon, the body could be reminded that curiosity is not separate from biology. The forest changed the meaning of silence. In a city of stone, silence may mean abandonment. In a tropical forest, silence can mean that the observer does not understand the language of signs. Human presence may remain in altered soil, old planting patterns, pottery fragments, or small changes in landform, but these signs are not always visible to the untrained eye, and they do not always match the outsider's expectation of what a city should look like. If a person expected walls, towers, and avenues of stone, another kind of settlement could pass almost unseen. This is why the Amazon became more than a setting for the search. It became a test of assumptions. It asked whether human achievement must look like ruins from other regions, or whether people in a wet environment might have built an organized life in ways that left quieter traces. At the same time, it would be dishonest to turn every mound, every story, or every strange line in the forest into proof of one lost city. The careful path lies between two errors. One error is to imagine the forest as empty because its evidence is difficult to read. The other is to fill every difficulty with a legend because the legend is more satisfying than uncertainty. Between those errors is a slower truth. The Amazon has held many human histories, but not all of them can be forced into a single dramatic name. For early human communities everywhere, survival depended on learning a place enough to become an extension of memory. Where water rose, where fish returned, where fruit ripened, where danger gathered, these patterns mattered more than distant glory. Over generations, such knowledge could build real landscapes of human life without producing ruins searchers expected. So the lost city story begins to shift. It is no longer only about people moving toward a hidden destination. It is about a meeting between a living environment and a human need to make meaning from what cannot yet be seen. The forest, the rivers, and the silence did not merely surround the search. They shaped the question itself. There is a quiet danger in saying that a city swallowed every explorer who searched for it, because the sentence sounds as if the place had a mouth, a will, and a hunger of its own. Real history rarely works with that kind of certainty. People disappear for human reasons, environmental reasons, and sometimes for reasons that can no longer be separated after the evidence has thinned. Yet the phrase still holds a truth if it is understood more slowly. A place can swallow people by refusing to become clear. It can take their roots, their notes, their confidence, their names, and leave behind only a question that grows larger than the facts. In that sense, the lost city did not need to stand openly in the forest to become powerful. It only needed to remain just beyond the reach of proof. Every searcher who moved toward it carried more than supplies. They carried assumptions about what a city should be and what a map should be able to promise. The deeper problem was not simply whether a hidden settlement existed somewhere beneath the trees. It was whether the human mind could accept a past that left signs without giving a complete answer. From the beginning of our species, survival depended on following incomplete evidence. A footprint in soft ground, a broken branch, the smell of water, the smoke of another camp, the return of birds at dusk. None of these were full explanations, but they were enough to guide movement. The same ancient ability that helped human beings live in uncertain landscapes also made them vulnerable to patterns they wanted to see. In the Amazon, that old ability met one of the most difficult archives on Earth. The forest could hold traces of human life while making them hard to separate from natural form. The result was a mystery that did not behave like a locked door. it behaved more like a mist. Walk toward it, and it shifted. Step back, and it seemed to form a shape again. This is why the idea of being swallowed matters. It is not only a story about bodies lost in trees, it is a story about attention lost inside possibility. A mound might be natural, or it might be shaped by people. A story might preserve memories on a commuted, or it might have changed as it moved from one listener to another. A path might lead toward a settlement, or toward exhaustion. A searcher could not always know which meaning was true while still standing inside the landscape. The forest forced every conclusion to remain unfinished. That unfinishedness is part of the human past itself. Most people who ever lived did not leave monuments. They left tools, hearths, gardens, bones, soil changes, oral memories, and patterns of movement that later ages may only partly understand. The beginning of humanity was not a line of kings and cities. It was small groups learning how to stay alive long enough for memory to pass from one generation to the next. When later people search for a lost city, they are often searching for a more comforting shape in history, a center, a name, a proof that someone was there. But older human life does not always give that comfort. It may leave a shadow rather than a wall. It may leave a landscape changed by hands that are gone. So the question at the center of the story must remain open. Perhaps the city swallowed explorers because it was physically hidden, surrounded by real dangers of water, distance, illness, and isolation. Perhaps it swallowed them because the promise of discovery made uncertainty feel like a path. Perhaps both were true in different ways. A real landscape can be dangerous, and an imagined destination can be dangerous too. Between those two forces, human beings walk with the same nervous gift that carried our ancestors across unknown ground, the need to know what lies beyond the trees. Long before the name of the Amazon reached European maps, human beings had already learned to fill distant places with longing. A horizon was never only a line where land or water ended. It was a question. Beyond it might be food, danger, enemies, shelter, new rivers, new animals, or people who knew a different way to live. This habit did not begin with empires or explorers. It began with the older human condition, a small body moving through a large world, trying to turn uncertainty into direction. For early people, searching was not romance. It was survival. A valley had to be checked after the season changed. A shoreline had to be followed when familiar ground no longer gave enough. A trail of animals could lead to meat, but also to risk. Over many thousands of years, the human mind became skilled at imagining what could not yet be seen. That skill helped our ancestors cross landscapes, but it also gave later societies a powerful temptation. When a blank space appeared on a map, it could feel less like ignorance and more like an invitation. By the time Europeans began hearing stories of rich cities and hidden kingdoms in the Americas, they were already prepared to believe that the edge of their knowledge concealed something enormous. The famous tales of El Dorado were not one simple story. They shifted across time, place, and expectation. Sometimes the name referred to a person, sometimes to a city, sometimes to a whole region of imagined wealth. What mattered was not only gold. What mattered was the belief that somewhere beyond the known route there was a center still waiting to be found. The people who chased such stories often carried real maps, real weapons, real hunger, and real fear. Yet they also carried a mental inheritance older than conquest, the urge to follow signs into the unknown. In the Amazon, that urge met a landscape that could absorb certainty. Rivers seemed to promise access, but they also scattered direction into countless bends and tributaries. Forest limited vision to a few steps ahead. Rain and heat worked against paper, metal, skin, and memory. A rumor could travel farther than a person, becoming clearer in words than it ever was on the ground. This is how lost places gain strength. They grow not because evidence is firm, but because distance protects them from being corrected too easily. Still, it would be too simple to dismiss every old search as foolish. Many explorers were wrong in what they expected, but they were not always wrong to think that human histories existed where outsiders saw only wilderness. Across the world, the past is often hidden because later eyes do not know how to recognize its form. The first settlements of our species were not born with towers. They began as repeated return, shared memory, used ground, tended plants, familiar water, and the slow joining of lives across generations. A place can be deeply human long before it becomes a city in the usual sense. That is why the history of lost cities is also a history of mistaken categories. Searchers wanted walls, treasures, inscriptions, and grand plazas because those signs match their idea of civilization. But human beings have always shaped places in more varied ways. Some left stone, some left earthworks, some left paths, some left soil made darker by long use, some left stories that changed as they passed from mouth to mouth. When later travellers entered lands they barely understood, they often confused absence of familiar signs with absence of people. The Amazon would become one of the greatest tests of that confusion. Before the lost city called Zed became a target, the older human pattern was already in place. A blank space, a rumour, a need to believe, and a landscape large enough to keep the question alive. Empires have often looked at the edge of a map and seen more than unknown land. They have seen a promise. Not always a promise that was true, and not always a promise that belonged to them, but a promise shaped by hunger, power, trade, fear, and imagination. When a map ended, the mind did not stop there. It continued beyond the ink. It placed rivers where reports were uncertain, mountains where travellers had only heard names, and cities where rumour had gathered enough weight to feel almost solid. This was one reason lost places became so persuasive in the age of imperial expansion. A blank space was not treated as a sign of limited knowledge. It was often treated as an opportunity. If there were people beyond the known route, there might be labour, tribute, land, crops, metals, allies, enemies, or stories that could be turned into authority. The world beyond the border of certainty became a place where ambition could hide inside curiosity. But beneath that ambition was something older than empire. The first humans did not live inside completed maps. They lived by testing edges. A riverbank, a tree line, a ridge, a shoreline, a dry plain after rain, each boundary asked whether movement should continue or stop. Those who paid attention to distant signs sometimes found food, shelter, or safer ground. That ancient pattern did not disappear when societies became larger. It was carried into caravans, ships, royal courts, survey expeditions, and colonial offices. The body still moved through uncertainty, but now uncertainty could be organized into policy, profit, and legend. This is why the idea of a lost city in the Amazon was never only a private dream. It belonged to a much longer history in which people, far from a landscape, imagined that the unknown must contain something waiting for them. The edge of the map became a moral danger because it allowed outsiders to mistake desire for evidence. A story heard from another language might lose its context. A report about a village could become a rumour of a kingdom. A memory of worked land could become a tale of buried treasure. A sign of complex life could be forced into the shape of a city because that was what searchers wanted to recognize. The Amazon made this even easier and more dangerous. Its scale protected uncertainty. Its rivers connected distant places while also confusing them. Its forests made it difficult for an outsider to judge what was old, what was recent, what was natural, and what had been shaped by human hands. In such a place, the reward imagined at the edge of knowledge could grow larger than the evidence that first suggested it. Yet the belief was not built only from greed. It also came from a real human discomfort with incompleteness. People want the past to have centres, names, and outlines. They want a lost world to become a located world. This desire reaches back to the origins of human memory, when knowing where something happened could mean the difference between survival and danger. A remembered water source, a dangerous crossing, a place where another group had camped, or a grove that returned with fruit each season. All of these turned space into meaning. Later, when maps became instruments of states and empires, that older need for meaningful place became entangled with conquest. The unknown was no longer just a landscape to understand. It became a claim to be made. That is where the lost city story becomes uneasy. The explorers who searched for it were not moving through empty space. They were entering lands already known by indigenous communities in ways that outside maps often ignored. The real human history of the region did not begin when outsiders wondered what might be hidden there. It had already been unfolding through settlement, movement, planting, trade, conflict, memory, and adaptation. To imagine a grand reward at the edge of the map was to risk missing the quieter truth already present beneath the trees. The Amazon was not waiting to become meaningful. It was meaningful before the search began. The habit of going farther than certainty may be one of the oldest habits our species carries. Long before formal roads, long before written records, and long before anyone drew a border around a country, human beings moved by reading small signs in large surroundings. A bent grass stem might suggest recent movement. A change in bird calls might suggest water or disturbance. A line of smoke might mean another camp, danger, company, or news. None of these clues gave complete knowledge, but each one invited a decision: stay, turn back, or continue. That quiet decision is near the root of the Lost City story. The explorers who later entered the Amazon with maps and notebooks were using tools from their own age, yet they also depended on a much older mental pattern: the ability to turn fragments into direction. It is a powerful gift, and it is not always safe. The same mind that can find a trail in uncertainty can also create a trail where the evidence is thin. This is how a blank space becomes more than blank. It becomes a place where expectation begins to walk ahead of the body. In early human life, such expectation could save lives. If a group remembered that a certain valley gave food after rain, they might survive a hard season. If they guessed that animals were moving toward water, they might follow and eat. If they imagined what lay beyond a ridge, that imagined future could guide their feet before sight confirmed it. Human survival was never built only on what was directly visible. It was built on memory, prediction, shared stories, and cautious risk. Later, when people spoke of hidden cities, the same deep structure remained, but it was stretched across wider distances and heavier desires. A rumor became like a footprint. A damaged account became like smoke in the distance. A name heard in another language became a ridge beyond which something might wait. The problem was that these signs were no longer simple survival clues. They were filtered through ambition, translation, misunderstanding, and the wish to find a shape grand enough to justify the journey. Still, the instinct itself was not foolish. Humans are meaning-making animals because meaning once helped the body stay alive. A place without meaning is difficult to move through. A forest without names is frightening. A map without details feels unfinished. So people name, connect, compare, and remember. They make lines between scattered points. Sometimes those lines become knowledge. Sometimes they become myth. The lost city stood in the unstable space between the two. It gathered pieces of real landscape, real indigenous presence, real reports of old habitation, and real European longing for discovery. Then it became a story that seemed to explain the blankness. That is why it could pull people forward. It offered not only a destination but relief from uncertainty. If the city existed, then the confusing forest had a center. If it could be found, then scattered clues would become a pattern. If the pattern became visible, then the searchers could believe the unknown had been mastered. But the human past does not always reward that need. Our beginnings were not organized around clean conclusions. They were made of movement, loss, adaptation, and memory passed through vulnerable bodies. Generations crossed rivers without leaving monuments. Families returned to useful places until those places became layered with use. Communities changed landscapes in ways that might be visible only to people patient enough to read soil, plants, and subtle form. In that older world, the first map was not paper, but remembered movement held inside living minds and shared beside fires at night. To search for a lost city, then, is also to search inside the human habit of turning emptiness into story. The danger begins when the story becomes stronger than the ground beneath it and the living body itself. Percy Fawcett is often remembered as if he were only a dreamer walking into the trees after a city made of rumour. That image is too simple. Before the lost city became attached to his name, he had already spent years as a trained officer, surveyor, and mapmaker in South America. He knew that a landscape was not understood by staring at it from far away. It had to be crossed, measured, endured, and compared against imperfect reports. His work placed him in borderlands where governments wanted lines drawn across forests, rivers, and mountains that did not care about political certainty. To make a map in such places was not a gentle task. It meant heat, insects, hunger, illness, difficult travel, and the slow discipline of observation. A river bend had to be noted. A ridge had to be placed in relation to another ridge. Distances had to be estimated with instruments, judgment, and repeated correction. Fawcett's later belief in a hidden ancient centre did not rise from complete ignorance of the forest. It rose from a strange mixture of experience, endurance, and interpretation. That mixture is important because it makes the story more human and more unsettling. A person who knows nothing can be dismissed easily. A person who has survived difficult country and still believes he sees a deeper pattern is harder to understand. Fawcett lived at a time when maps still carried authority, but also confessed their own limits. Large areas of the world had been named by outsiders without being truly known by them. A line could be printed with confidence while the ground beneath it remained uncertain, inhabited, contested, and only partly recorded. In that gap between map and land, the old human habit of searching returned in a modern form. Our earliest ancestors did not possess instruments or printed charts, but they also lived by measuring space. The walk between water and shelter, the distance from danger, the memory of a route that children could learn and repeat. A map, in its deepest sense, began as memory held inside moving bodies. Fawcett carried metal tools and paper, yet his body still had to solve the same ancient problem: how to remain alive while moving through a place larger than certainty. The forest did not reward pride. It tested feet, skin, stomach, patience, and sleep. It also tested the mind's ability to separate a sign from a wish. During his surveying work, Fawcett heard reports, saw landscapes that challenged easy assumptions, and encountered indigenous knowledge that did not fit neatly into European ideas of wilderness. He was not alone in thinking that Amazonia might hold deeper histories than outsiders had admitted. The danger was in how those hints could gather around a single imagined destination. A careful observation could become attached to hope, a story could become a coordinate, a possibility could become a mission. This is not unusual in human life. Many discoveries begin when someone refuses to treat uncertainty as emptiness. Many errors begin the same way. Fawcett stood near that thin boundary. He had enough experience to believe that received opinion could be wrong, but experience itself does not protect a person from belief. Sometimes it strengthens belief because the survivor trusts his own reading of hardship. The lost city that drew him inward was therefore not born only from fantasy. It was shaped by maps, journeys, reports, and a real debate about what kind of human past the Amazon might have held. Yet none of that proves the city in the form he imagined. It only explains why the idea could feel believable to him, and why a trained man could walk toward a question until the question became larger than the map. Experience can protect a person from many illusions, but it can also give an illusion a stronger foundation. Fawcett had crossed real rivers, measured real borders, and survived real discomforts in country that punished careless movement. He knew that printed maps could be wrong because he had helped correct them. He knew that official knowledge was often only a thin layer placed over landscapes, already known in other ways by indigenous communities, rubber workers, traders, and local guides. These experiences mattered. They gave him reasons to distrust easy dismissal. When people far away imagined the Amazon as empty or incapable of supporting complex human life, he had grounds to suspect that the judgment was too simple. Yet suspicion is not the same as proof. Slowly, the difference between a reasonable doubt and a personal conviction can become difficult to see, especially when a person has lived through enough hardship to trust his own endurance. A map begins as a tool, but in the hands of a searching mind it can become a promise. Lines, river courses, fragments of old reports, and second-hand stories may first appear as separate pieces. Then the mind begins to connect them. One journey confirms that the forest is larger than official certainty. Another suggests that older people may have moved through it in ways outsiders failed to record. A conversation gives a name. A document gives a hint. A landscape gives an impression of hidden order. None of these alone needs to be false for the final picture to become uncertain. Human beings have always worked like this. Our ancestors survived by joining fragments into patterns before full proof arrived. If tracks led toward water, the body could not wait for perfect evidence. If clouds gathered above distant hills, movement had to be judged before rain fell. Pattern making is ancient, useful, and deeply human, but when the pattern concerns a lost city, the same ability can become a quiet risk. Fawcett's belief in Z seems to have grown not from one single sign, but from accumulation. Real travel gave weight to rumour. Real surveying gave shape to speculation. Real encounters with human landscapes made it easier to imagine that the forest might have concealed something larger. His confidence did not need to be reckless in the beginning. It could have developed through small shifts, each one understandable by itself. First, the Amazon was not empty. Then, older societies may have existed there in forms outsiders did not understand. Then, traces and accounts might point toward a hidden centre. Then, that hidden centre became the goal. The danger was not that every step was foolish. The danger was that each step made the last one feel more certain than the evidence could safely bear. In the deep history of humanity, this movement from clue to story has always shaped migration, memory, and discovery. A family returns to a useful place, and the place becomes known. A route is repeated, and the route becomes tradition. A remembered danger is told to children, and the story preserves life. But stories also gather extra weight as they pass through generations and across languages. They can carry knowledge, misunderstanding, warning, pride, and longing at the same time. Fawcett stood inside that old human inheritance with modern tools in his hands. His notebooks, maps, and plans belonged to the 20th century, but the force pulling them together was much older. The need to make scattered signs answer one question. By the time Z became his destination, it was no longer only a mark somewhere beyond known routes. It had become the point where his experiences, his reading of history, and his private confidence met. That is why the search feels so difficult to judge. It was not pure fantasy, and it was not verified fact. It was a human conviction formed in the narrow space between evidence and desire. A person who has survived danger can become cautious, but he can also become certain in a way that is difficult for others to reach. Fawcett had learned that the forest was not a blank surface waiting for European names. He had seen how much official knowledge depended on fragments, guesses, and reports gathered from people who rarely received credit for what they knew. In that setting, doubt could feel like intelligence. If scholars and officials far away were too confident that Amazonia could not have held older complex societies, then perhaps the correct response was to look again. That beginning is reasonable. The trouble comes when looking again slowly turns into believing that one has already seen the outline of the answer. Fawcett seems to have trusted not only his instruments, but the pattern that had formed inside him after years of travel. He knew that rivers could hide movement instead of revealing it. He knew that thick vegetation could cover old ground until it looked untouched. He knew that indigenous stories, old documents, and small landscape signs could not simply be dismissed because they did not look like stone ruins. Yet every one of these truths could support more than one conclusion. They could mean that the Amazon held many forms of human history. They could mean that searchers had been asking the wrong questions. They did not have to mean that one hidden city waited in the forest. The human mind often struggles with that difference. From our earliest beginnings, the body needed decisions before certainty arrived. A group hearing water beyond trees could not debate forever. A family following animal tracks across soft ground had to decide whether the trail was fresh enough to trust. A remembered route could fade, and still people had to move. This gave human beings a mind that leans forward. It gathers pieces, fills gaps, and treats a possible path as something almost solid. In ordinary survival, that gift could keep people alive. In a vast search, it could turn uncertainty into a destination. Fawcett was not foolish for thinking there was more to Amazonian history than outsiders understood. In broad terms, later archaeology has made that caution look justified. The region did contain deep and varied human landscapes, including settlements, earthworks, altered soils, and traces of long habitation. But broad truth is not the same as a precise proof. A whole region can be richer than old assumptions, while a specific imagined place remains unverified. That is the delicate boundary his story stands on. He was right to suspect emptiness was a misleading idea. He may have been wrong to let that suspicion gather around a single name. This is why his confidence feels so haunting. It came from real contact with difficulty. He had paid for knowledge with fatigue, illness, heat, and risk. A person who has endured such things may feel that the land has spoken to him directly, yet landscapes do not speak in full sentences. They offer traces. People translate them. Translation is always shaped by need, memory, pride, and hope. Fawcett's need was not merely to find ruins. It was to show that the green interior, so often reduced by outsiders to wilderness, had once held a human order worthy of being recognized. That desire carried a moral force, because it resisted the idea of an empty forest. But desire, even when it points toward a fairer question, still cannot replace evidence. The lost city became dangerous at exactly that point. It stood where a valid doubt hardened into a personal mission. To him, the clues may have seemed to converge. To history, they remain unfinished. Between those two views lies the old human risk. The more deeply we want the ground to answer, the more carefully we must listen to what it has not said. For a long time, many outsiders looked at the Amazon and imagined a landscape too difficult for large, lasting communities. The reasoning seemed simple from a distance. Rainforest soil was often described as thin, acidic, and easily exhausted after clearing. Heavy rain washed nutrients away. Heat and moisture broke down wood, fibre, bone, and plant remains. Stone buildings, if they were expected, were not visible across the green canopy. To people trained to recognize civilization through temples, walls, roads of cut stone, and written inscriptions, the forest appeared to offer very little. It seemed to erase the very evidence that elsewhere had made ancient societies easy to name. From that distance, a misleading conclusion could form. If the evidence was not obvious, perhaps the society had never been complex. The danger in that conclusion is quiet, but serious. It confuses the limits of an observer with the limits of a place. Human beings have never built their lives from one universal material. From the beginning, our ancestors used what the ground allowed: stone where stone was useful, wood where wood was near, bone where animals were taken, clay where riverbanks offered it, and memory where physical traces could not last. A wet forest does not preserve human presence in the same way as a dry cave, a desert, or a limestone ruin. It changes the archive. It makes the past softer, less upright, less willing to stand above the soil in a form that strangers can immediately understand. This is why the older image of an empty Amazon must be approached with caution. The region was not empty simply because outsiders failed to see monuments they expected. It was also not automatically filled with lost cities of legend simply because the older assumption was wrong. The careful truth is slower. Tropical forest environments can support human life, but the forms of settlement, farming, travel, and memory may differ from the stone-centered models people often carry in their minds. Communities can shape riversides, forest islands, planting zones, paths, soils, and raised ground without leaving the kind of ruins that dominate a distant imagination. For early human groups anywhere on Earth, place was first known through use. A camp returned to after rain, a tree species encouraged near home, a patch of ground enriched over time. A route followed between water and food. These were not minor details. They were the early grammar of belonging. In Amazonia, many human traces appear to have been written in that grammar. Subtle, repeated, environmental, and easy to misread if one expects history to announce itself in stone. The older view also carried the weight of colonial thinking. It allowed outsiders to picture forest people as small, scattered, and nearly untouched by history, as if the trees had kept them outside the main human story. That idea is now widely treated with much more skepticism. Archaeologists, ecologists, and indigenous knowledge keep pointing toward a more complicated past, one in which people changed soils, managed useful plants, built earth forms, lived along waterways, and created landscapes that were neither untouched wilderness nor simple copies of cities elsewhere. Still, careful language matters. To say the Amazon was more human-shaped than once believed is not the same as saying every legend is true. To say complex societies existed in the wider region is not the same as locating Fawcett Z. The lost city gains its meaning from this boundary. It sits between an old mistake and a new temptation. First, the mistake of emptiness. Then, the temptation to overcorrect and turn every clue into proof. History asks for patience between them. The forest may have hidden more human life than outsiders once imagined, but hidden does not mean known. It means the past is present in quieter forms, waiting for methods careful enough to hear it without forcing it to speak too loudly, and humbly enough to wait when needed. The strongest challenge to the old image of an empty Amazon has not come from a single dramatic discovery. It has come from many quieter signs, spread across different places and read slowly by different methods. Darkened soils, often discussed as human-enriched earth, suggest that people in parts of the region changed the ground through long use. Burning, discarded food, charcoal, pottery, and organic waste. Pottery fragments point to settled or repeated life along rivers and other useful places. Raised fields, ditches, causeways, mounds, and geometric earthworks in some areas show that human hands could reshape wet ground, guide movement, manage water, and mark space without building in stone. These are not the signs that old adventure stories usually trained listeners to expect. They are not golden towers rising above the canopy. They are the traces of everyday organization, where people cooked, planted, gathered, walked, buried, returned, and taught children what the land meant. That kind of evidence changes the question behind the lost city. It does not prove that Fawcett Z existed as one hidden metropolis waiting in the trees. It does something more careful. It shows that the forest could contain forms of human complexity that outsiders once failed to imagine. A landscape may look natural to a passing eye and still carry the memory of many generations. This is close to the beginning of the human story itself. The first people did not enter the world as builders of monuments. They entered as living bodies learning repetition, where to find water, which plants returned, which ground stayed dry, which paths connected safety to food. Over time, repetition can become design. Design can become tradition. Tradition can become a landscape that later observers may not recognize as human-made because it has grown together with trees, soil, and rivers. In the Amazon, this is especially important. A road may not survive like a paved Roman road, but an old route can shape settlement, movement, and memory. A house built from plant materials may return to earth, but the soil beneath it may carry change. A garden may not look like a field to someone expecting straight ploughed rows, yet managed forests and useful plant concentrations can reveal long relationships between people and place. The evidence asks for a different imagination, not a careless one. It asks us to recognize that civilization is not only what remains hard after centuries, it may also be what remains patterned. The danger is to turn these patterns into a single answer too quickly. A ditch is not automatically a city. A dark soil patch is not automatically a capital. A mound is not automatically proof of a lost kingdom. Each sign has to be studied in context, compared with nearby evidence, dated carefully when possible, and interpreted with respect for the people whose descendants may still understand the land in ways outside researchers do not. This patience protects the story from becoming false. It also makes the mystery deeper. If Amazonia held many human-shaped landscapes, then the idea of a lost city may be less like one buried jewel and more like a distorted echo of a wider truth. Searchers may have been wrong in the shape of what they wanted, yet not entirely wrong that there was something to look for. That is a colder and more honest possibility. It means the forest may have swallowed not only explorers, but categories. It swallowed the easy division between wilderness and civilization, between empty nature and human place, between legend and evidence. The people who searched for one clear city were entering a region where the past may have been distributed across river networks, seasonal grounds, villages, gardens, earthworks, and memories. Human origins remind us why this matters. We became human not by separating ourselves completely from environments, but by learning them so deeply that movement, food, shelter, kinship, and memory became tied to particular ground. The Amazon's archaeological traces do not close the mystery. They widen it in a more responsible way, replacing a simple lost city with the harder question of how much human life can hide in plain sight when later eyes are trained to see the wrong things. The newer picture of Amazonia does not give permission to turn every old rumor into a discovered fact. It asks for something more patient and more useful. It asks us to hold two ideas together without forcing them to become one. First, the Amazon was not an empty green world waiting outside history. Many places within it carry evidence of long human presence, environmental knowledge, settlement, movement, cultivation, and social organization. Second, the specific lost city that Fawcett imagined has not been proven in the clear, direct way that a responsible account would require. Those two statements do not cancel each other. They create the honest space where the story belongs. The mystery becomes deeper not because we can now say the legend was true, but because the old reason for dismissing it has weakened. If the forest once supported more human activity than many outsiders believed, then the question is no longer whether people could have lived there in meaningful and organized ways. They did. The harder question is what kind of life they built, how widely it spread, how it changed through time, and why later observers were so slow to recognize its traces. That question reaches back toward the beginning of human history. Our ancestors did not become human by building cities first. They became human by learning how to belong to places, how to remember water, return to useful ground, share roots, recognize seasons, and pass knowledge from one vulnerable body to another. A human landscape can begin long before it looks like a city. It begins when memory and ground are tied together. In Amazonia, that bond may have taken forms that were easy for outsiders to underestimate. A settlement built with wood, palm, fibre and earth may not survive like cut stone. A managed forest may look wild to someone who does not know which useful plants were encouraged over generations. A raised field or ditch may seem like a minor shape until it is read beside other signs. A dark soil deposit may appear ordinary until it is understood as the result of repeated human life. These traces do not shout. They accumulate. They ask to be read in relation to rivers, plants, pottery, landforms, and living knowledge. The lost city story becomes more responsible when it is placed inside that wider pattern, but also more restrained. It may be that Fawcett Z was an exaggerated idea built from scattered reports, real landscapes, indigenous accounts, older documents, and his own confidence. It may be that he was sensing a broader truth about Amazonian history while imagining it in a form too concentrated, too singular, and too close to the expectations of his own age. That possibility is important because it avoids both extremes. It does not laugh at the search as pure fantasy. It also does not bless the legend as fact. It lets the evidence remain what it is, suggestive, complex, uneven, and still incomplete. Human beings often prefer simpler answers because simple answers are restful to the mind. A lost city is easier to picture than a network of settlements, gardens, paths, earthworks, and remembered territories spread across changing river worlds. A single vanished place is easier to name than many communities whose histories were damaged by disease, violence, displacement, and the decay of materials that did not last. But the past is not required to match the shape of our curiosity. The first people who made landscapes meaningful did not know they were leaving evidence for later centuries. They were living through daily needs: food, kinship, safety, birth, loss, sleep, return, and teaching. If their traces are quiet now, that silence does not make them less human. It only reminds us that history is often preserved unevenly. So the lost city remains suspended between evidence and desire. The forest has not handed over the dramatic answer that legend wants. Yet it has given enough signs to change the older question. The mystery is no longer only what city was lost. It is how much human life was once missed because people were looking for the wrong kind of proof. A lost city in a wet forest would not vanish in the same way as a city of stone on a dry plain. It would fade by changing form. Walls made from timber, palm, clay, or thatch do not stand forever when rain enters every seam and insects work through every fibre. Roofs collapse first, posts soften. Floors become soil again, paths fill with seedlings. Water carries loose earth from one place to another, and roots enter spaces that human hands once cleared. After enough seasons, a house can become a low rise, a ditch can become a shadow, and a road can become only a difference in vegetation. To a traveller expecting masonry, such traces may look like nothing at all. This is one of the central difficulties in imagining any hidden settlement in Amazonia. The forest does not preserve the past, as a museum preserves an object behind glass. It changes the past chemically, biologically, and visually. Heat speeds decay. Moisture invites fungi. Leaves fall, rot, and create new surfaces over old ones. Rivers flood, retreat, and leave fresh layers of mud. Animals burrow. Trees fall and open light for new growth. A human clearing, if abandoned, can be taken back by plants so thoroughly that later eyes may see only wilderness. Yet that wilderness may not be untouched. It may be a second life growing over the first. This pattern reaches back to the earliest human presence anywhere on Earth. Our ancestors did not always leave durable monuments. They left fireplaces that cooled, camps that moved, bones that broke, tools that were lost, seeds that were carried, and pathways remembered by bodies before they were ever marked by signs. Much of early human life was made from perishable things: skin, wood, fibre, grass, bark, food, voice, and memory. These materials served the living well, but they did not promise to explain themselves to distant descendants. In the Amazon, that problem becomes sharper because the environment is so good at returning organic matter to the living cycle. A wooden post that once held a roof may become food for insects and microbes. A garden edge may become part of a forest pattern. A canoe landing may be altered by one season of high water. The land does not lie, but it often speaks in traces too soft for quick certainty. This is why the idea of a swallowed city must be handled with care. If searchers fail to find walls, that does not prove no organized human place had ever existed. If they found irregular ground, that does not prove a city stood there either. The evidence sits between disappearance and imagination. Archaeology has to slow the mind down, because the mind wants the old shapes back. Streets, gates, plazas, names. The forest offers something quieter: soil colour, buried ceramics, alignments, raised forms, plant distributions, and small disturbances that only make sense when studied together. For people who lived there, the city, if that word even applies, may not have meant a stone centre surrounded by empty land. It may have meant a network of homes, paths, gardens, water routes, gathering places, and remembered boundaries. Human beings began by turning useful ground into known ground. A place became human through return, care, repair, teaching, and burial. In a dry region, some of that care may harden into visible ruin. In a wet forest, the same care may sink into soil and living growth. This does not make such lives smaller. It only means their evidence follows another rhythm, closer to decay, renewal, and repeated use than to permanent display. The lost city, then, may have been less a monument waiting under leaves than a pattern absorbed into the land. What swallowed it was not only mystery, but climate, material, time, and the quiet labour of the forest rebuilding itself over every human mark, season after season without pause. A stone city teaches the eye to expect survival in hard shapes. Cut blocks remain after roofs collapse. Columns break but still announce where people once gathered. Steps wear down and continue to point toward doors that no longer exist. In dry places, a wall can outlive the hands that raised it by thousands of years, and later visitors may feel that history has kindly left its outline exposed. A forest city would ask for another kind of seeing. If people built mainly with wood, palm, earth, fibre and clay, their world could be highly organized, while still leaving few upright remains. Houses could be rebuilt many times on the same ground without creating the kind of ruin that looks impressive from a distance. A meeting place could matter deeply to a community and yet return to soil within generations. A path could carry trade, marriage, warning, and memory, while after abandonment becoming only a faint corridor of different trees. The difference is not a difference between civilization and absence. It is a difference between materials, climate, and the way time treats them. Human beings have always made life from what is near. The earliest shelters were not designed for archaeologists to admire. They were made to keep rain off sleeping bodies, to hold warmth near children, to mark a safe place beside water or food. A branch frame, a hide covering, a hearth, a patch of cleared ground, a line of stones holding an edge. These small arrangements were part of the beginning of human architecture. They mattered because bodies are vulnerable. They need shade, rest, protection, and familiar space. Over long periods, those practical acts can become settlement patterns, but the evidence they leave depends on what survives. Stone favours memory. Wood favours use. Soil keeps some secrets and loses others. This is why comparing Amazonian traces to stone cities elsewhere can quietly distort the question. A city of stone says, "Look here." A city of earth and plant matter may say, "Look closer." It may not rise above the canopy. It may lie in the colour of soil, the shape of a mound, the curve of a ditch, the distribution of useful trees, or pottery lying below leaffall. It may require patience rather than spectacle. For outside searchers, this was a difficult lesson. They often carried pictures in their minds before they entered the forest. They knew what ancient greatness looked like in the Mediterranean, Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Andes, where stone, mud, brick, or dry conditions preserved monumental forms. When the Amazon did not present the same signs, some concluded that the human past there must have been smaller, but a wet landscape can hold another logic. Its builders may have planned for repair rather than permanence. They may have organized movement around rivers instead of paved avenues. They may have shaped gardens, managed trees, raised ground, and connected settlements through paths that were meaningful in use, not in long survival. None of this proves the lost city as Fawcett imagined it. It only protects us from a narrow standard of proof that recognizes one kind of endurance and misses another. In the deep origin of our species, nothing about human life promised permanent monuments. What mattered was the continuity of knowledge from elder to child, from one season to the next, from one remembered place to another. If a community knew how to keep living in a demanding forest, that knowledge was a form of structure, even when the structures themselves decayed. The lost city story becomes calmer and more serious when seen this way. Perhaps what was sought as a hard ruin was, in reality, a softer history, organized, inhabited, and meaningful, but written in materials that time could fold back into the land. To find such a past, a searcher had to change not only direction, but the very meaning of evidence itself. The human body explains why people build differently in different worlds. A body walking under Amazonian rain does not need the same shelter as a body sleeping in desert cold or mountain wind. It needs shade, drainage, dry ground, nearby water, food that can be reached again, and materials that can be repaired. From that simple truth, many forms of human settlement can grow without becoming the kind of ruin an outsider expects. A community may choose wood because wood is near, light, workable, and alive in the surrounding forest. It may choose palm leaves because they shed rain. It may raise a floor because the ground floods. It may open paths toward rivers because water is the main road. These choices are practical before they are symbolic. They come from knees bending, hands cutting, children sleeping, elders remembering, and families returning after each season. In the deepest origin of human life, culture began not as decoration, but as an answer to the body's needs. Fire answered cold and darkness. Shelter answered exposure. Tools answered teeth and hands that were clever but not enough. A path answered the danger of forgetting where safety lay. When later people speak about lost cities, they often picture architecture first, but architecture began as biology extended into space. A roof is a second skin. A wall is a calmer edge between the body and the night. A path is memory placed on the ground so the feet can follow it again. In Amazonia, such extensions of the body could be strong in use and weak in preservation. The forest gave materials that made sense for living there, not for lasting there after abandonment. That distinction is essential for the story of the lost city. If Fawcett and others imagined a hidden place with a recognizable center, they were also imagining a type of survival after time, something visible enough to reward the search. But the people who may have shaped older Amazonian landscapes did not live for future searchers. They lived within rain, rivers, insects, soil, plants, hunger, kinship, and memory. Their choices were shaped by staying alive and staying connected, not by leaving a permanent monument. A settlement can be real because people sleep there, cook there, teach there, bury there, and trade there. It does not become unreal because its beams rot after the people leave. The body also helps explain why the forest could seem to swallow explorers. Searchers entered with bodies that needed the same things as all humans, but without the same inherited knowledge of place. Heat changes judgment. Wet clothing rubs skin raw. Poor sleep weakens attention. Hunger makes distance feel longer. Illness narrows the mind until a map becomes less useful than rest. The forest did not have to be evil to become overwhelming. It only had to be an environment where unfamiliar bodies could not keep pace with unfamiliar signs. Indigenous communities had long histories of knowing such landscapes, but outsiders often treated the land as a puzzle to be solved rather than a home understood. That difference matters. A place that is dangerous to one traveller can be meaningful, navigable, and lived in by another. The lost city should not be imagined only as a structure hidden under leaves. It should be understood as a question about adaptation. What kind of human life can a wet forest support? What kind of evidence does that life leave? What happens when searchers demand stone-like proof from a world where human skill may have been expressed through repair, movement, planting, and return? The answer is not simple, and it should not be forced. The safest thought is quieter. People build from the materials, climates, and bodily limits they are given. Some histories stand upright after centuries. Others sink into soil, roots, and memory, not because they were less human, but because they belonged more to conditions of their time. In the year 1925, the search for the lost city moved from belief into final movement. Percy Fawcett did not go alone. With him were his son Jack and Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel, 3 human bodies entering a landscape that had already become heavy with expectation before their first steps disappeared into it. The journey has often been remembered as if it were a clean line drawn toward a hidden destination, but on the ground it would have been nothing like a line. It would have been weather, water, fatigue, insects, supplies, waiting, decisions, and the slow pressure of distance. They were not simply travelling into trees. They were moving into a region where outside certainty became weaker with every bend of river and every day beyond reliable contact. Fawcett believed he was moving towards Z, the name he had given to a possible ancient centre somewhere in the interior. The exact form of that place remained uncertain, even in his own time. It was not a photographed ruin, not a mapped city, not a proven archaeological site. It was a conclusion he had drawn from experience, reports, older documents, and the conviction that Amazonia had been misunderstood. That difference matters. The expedition was real, the danger was real, the people were real, but the city as a specific destination remained unverified. To tell the story honestly, those facts have to stand beside each other without being forced into a simple legend. Fawcett, Jack, and Rimmel carried the tools and hopes of their age, but underneath those modern objects was the same ancient vulnerability that has followed every human journey into unknown ground. A person may carry a compass, but the body still needs water. A person may carry a map, but the skin still feels heat, the stomach still weakens, and sleep still decides the sharpness of thought. Our earliest ancestors survived by moving through uncertain places in small groups, trusting memory, observation, and the knowledge of others. Here, that old pattern returned under a modern name. 3 people moved through a world they could not fully command, guided by signs that seemed meaningful enough to continue. The forest around them was not empty space. Indigenous communities lived in and knew parts of those landscapes through histories far older than the expedition. That is essential to remember, because the story is sometimes told as if the men entered a blank wilderness. They did not. They entered a human region, but not one arranged for their understanding or safety. To local people, rivers, trails, useful plants, dangerous places, and social boundaries could carry meanings outsiders did not easily read. To an expedition, those same features could become obstacles, clues, or uncertainties. Fawcett's final route has been debated and reconstructed in different ways, but the broad outline is enough for the mood of the story. He went inward, sent messages from the edge of contact, and then the messages stopped. That stopping is the most powerful fact, because it is also the most limited. History does not give a clear final scene. It gives no verified moment in which the city appears, no certain account of death, no final sentence spoken under the trees. It gives absence. It gives a broken chain of communication. The human mind dislikes that kind of ending, so it tries to repair it with images: a hidden ruin, a hostile encounter, a wrong turn, illness, starvation, a river crossing, a camp lost beyond recovery. Some possibilities may be more reasonable than others, but certainty remains out of reach. The lost city begins to swallow the story exactly there, where evidence ends and imagination continues walking. What can be said carefully is this. In 1925, 3 men entered the Amazon in search of a place that had become more powerful than proof, and after a certain point, the world outside heard nothing more. What can be followed safely is not a dramatic final scene, but the thin trail of communication before silence. Fawcett's last expedition left behind messages that still matter because they show how the search looked before it became legend. He wrote with confidence, and he tried to prevent rescue parties from rushing after him if contact stopped. That instruction has often been read as courage, but it can also be read as an awareness of how dangerous the region was for anyone who entered without preparation, knowledge, or permission. A lost person in such a landscape could become the reason other people became lost as well. The story was already carrying that danger inside it. A message sent from the edge of contact is a fragile thing. It depends on distance, carriers, weather, trust, timing, and the hope that paper can cross what bodies may not. Once a letter leaves the hand, it belongs to roots and people beyond the writer's control. Before writing existed, human groups carried messages in voices, gestures, paths, and remembered warnings. Knowledge moved from body to body because survival depended on it. Where water could be found, which ground flooded, which neighbours were friendly, which places should be avoided. These were not abstract facts. They were instructions for remaining alive. In Fawcett's case, the written message stood at the meeting point between modern exploration and that older human need to send warning across distance. It said, in effect, that the search must continue forward, but others should not follow carelessly. After that, certainty thins. There are reports of where the men had been, names attached to places along the route, recollections from people who later tried to reconstruct the movement, and many theories built on what little remained. But the responsible story must not pretend that the record becomes clearer than it is. The men did not leave behind a confirmed diary of their final days. No verified ruin rose at the end of their path to explain the silence. No certain chain of events was preserved by history. There was only a gradual failure of contact, and in that failure the lost city became more powerful. The mind began to imagine what the documents could not say. Perhaps illness came first. Perhaps exhaustion. Perhaps conflict. Perhaps a misunderstanding with people whose land they entered. Perhaps hunger, injury, misdirection, or the quiet accumulation of small mistakes that become fatal only when there is no margin left. Each possibility has to remain a possibility, not a scene invented for comfort. The Amazon did not need one dramatic cause to become dangerous. For unfamiliar travellers, danger could be distributed through the whole journey. The body weakens a little each day. Wet ground slows the feet. Heat steals water from the skin. Food becomes a calculation. Insects disturb sleep. A wrong judgment made while tired can grow into a serious error. This is how human disappearance often happens. Not as a single door closing, but as many small supports giving way. The beginning of our species teaches the same lesson in reverse. Humans survived because groups learned to reduce uncertainty together. They shared routes, watched one another's condition, and placed memory around danger. Alone or nearly alone, even a skilled person becomes more vulnerable. Fawcett, Jack and Rimmel were not swallowed by a proven city in any literal sense that history can confirm. They were swallowed by a widening space where messages ended, evidence weakened, and the question outlived the bodies that had carried it forward. The silence after their last known communication is not an answer. It is the border of what can honestly be said. The most important moment in the final journey is not a scene anyone saw clearly. It is the moment when information stopped moving. Before that silence, there were names, plans, routes, letters, confidence, and the ordinary human belief that distance can still be crossed by words. After it, there was only waiting. That waiting changed everything. A living expedition became a mystery. A search for a possible ancient place became a story about 3 missing people. A question about Amazonian history became a question about the limits of knowing itself. This is why the disappearance should be treated without dramatic invention. The silence is powerful enough. No responsible account needs to imagine a final campfire. a last glimpse of ruins, or a single violent instant hidden by trees. History often breaks more quietly than that. It breaks when a message expected on one side of the forest never arrives from the other. It breaks when families and officials look at the same absence and cannot turn it into fact. It breaks when the world outside continues to move while three names remain fixed at the edge of a map. For human beings, a broken message is deeply disturbing because our species has always depended on shared knowledge. The earliest groups survived not only because individuals were strong, but because information moved between them. Someone remembered a dry path. Someone warned of danger near water. Someone knew which fruit ripened after rain. Someone carried news of another group beyond the ridge. A life could depend on a sentence passed at the right time. When communication stops, the human world shrinks. People outside cannot help. People inside cannot explain. Between those two helpless positions, imagination begins to work. In the case of Fawcett, Jack, and Rimmel, that imagination had unusually fertile ground. They were searching for a place already shaped by uncertainty. They entered a forest already misunderstood by outsiders. They vanished in a region where local knowledge, colonial maps, rumours, and archaeological possibility overlapped uneasily. Their silence did not close the story. It opened more rooms inside it. Some later accounts tried to locate them through testimony. Some tried to follow possible routes. Some hoped for remains, objects, or a final explanation. Yet the more people searched for a neat ending, the more the absence seemed to deepen. This does not mean the forest was supernatural or that the city was a living trap. It means that real landscapes can overwhelm the systems people use to keep events understandable. A map depends on points. A letter depends on delivery. A rescue depends on direction. A conclusion depends on evidence. Remove enough of these supports, and even a modern story begins to resemble the oldest human fear. Someone has gone beyond the circle of shared memory and cannot be called back. That fear reaches into the beginning of our species. To leave a group was always to risk more than physical danger. It was to risk being lost from the chain of voices that made a person socially alive. A body could vanish into distance, but so could its story. In 1925, the outside world was left with that older kind of wound, not simply death, because death itself was not clearly witnessed. Not simply failure, because the goal remained uncertain. Not discovery, because no proof returned. Only interruption. That interruption gave the lost city its darkest power. It allowed the idea of Z to absorb the men who pursued it, and to absorb the later questions that gathered around them. The city, whether real in some form, exaggerated from scattered evidence, or never present as Fawcett imagined it, became inseparable from the silence after his last messages. What was swallowed, above all, was the ordinary line between journey and return. Once that line disappeared, the forest held the story in a form no one could fully recover, and absence itself began to feel almost historical. After Fawcett, the silence did not remain still. It began to move through other people. Families, officials, journalists, adventurers, and later researchers all looked toward the same broken line in the forest and wondered whether it could be followed back to an answer. Some went because they hoped to find the missing men. Some went because they hoped the lost city might still be there. Some went because the two desires had become almost impossible to separate. A rescue can begin as compassion and turn into a second search for glory without anyone clearly noticing the change. That is one reason the mystery grew instead of closing. Each attempt to solve it added another layer of footprints, stories, claims, disappointments, and uncertain reports. The forest did not only hold the original disappearance, it began to hold the history of looking for the people who had disappeared. This is a very human pattern. When someone vanishes beyond the edge of shared knowledge, the group left behind cannot simply accept the blank. From the earliest human communities, absence demanded movement. If a hunter did not return, others looked for tracks. If a child wandered away, voices called through trees. If a family failed to reach a seasonal meeting place, people searched the route. To search for the missing was not only emotional, it protected the living memory of the group. A person lost without explanation threatened the trust that paths, warnings, and return could still hold a community together. In the 20th century Amazon, That ancient reaction was carried into a world of newspapers, expeditions, maps, and public fascination. The result was not clarity, but multiplication. Every later journey entered a landscape already crowded with expectation. Searchers were not stepping into a neutral place. They were stepping into a story that told them there might be a city, a trace, a grave, a survivor, an object, or a final clue just beyond the next distance. Some accounts from later searches were sincere but incomplete. Some were shaped by memory, translation, hope, fear, or the desire to be believed. In a region where many local communities had their own histories and boundaries, outside searchers could easily misunderstand what they heard or where they stood. A name could be attached to the wrong place. A recovered object could be given too much meaning. A rumour could travel outward and harden into news before anyone knew how to test it. The more the world wanted an ending, the more fragile evidence seemed to carry. Yet the continued searches also reveal something important and less sensational. Fawcett was not the only person swallowed by the idea of Z. The idea reached beyond his body and his lifetime. It drew others into its orbit because it offered a rare combination: a vanished expedition, a possible ancient place, a vast forest, and a past that modern knowledge had not fully organized. For the human mind, that combination is difficult to leave alone. We are descended from beings who survived by returning to unfinished signs, checking them again, comparing them with memory, and asking whether the ground had more to say. A mark in mud, a broken branch, or a missing voice could begin a search that held a group together. That same ancient loyalty can become restless when the missing person is tied to a greater mystery. But in a modern mystery, repeated looking does not always bring resolution. Sometimes it spreads the uncertainty farther. The search for Fawcett became a chain of questions, each one linked to the last, each one promising to repair the break and then leaving another break behind. In that way, the lost city did not swallow only the first expedition. It swallowed the attention of those who came after, turning rescue into legend and legend into a long echo through the forest, still unfinished whenever the old story is spoken aloud again. To search for a missing person is already to enter a difficult kind of time. The present keeps moving, but the searcher walks backward, trying to recover the last known step, the last spoken plan, the last place where a living path can still be imagined. When the missing person was Fawcett, that backward movement became tangled with another search, the forward pull towards Z. People did not only want to know where he had gone, they wanted to know whether he had been right. This changed the emotional weight of every later journey. A rescue party might begin with human concern, but the forest around that concern was filled with a larger promise. If one could find the trail, perhaps one could find the men. If one could find the men, perhaps one could find the city. If one could find the city, perhaps the silence would finally explain itself. That chain of hope is powerful, and it can quietly rearrange judgment. The missing explorer becomes not only a person to be found, but a key to a hidden world. The danger is that a human life, with all its ordinary fragility, becomes absorbed into a legend that seems larger than the person. From the beginning of human history, groups searched for the missing because no one was only an individual body. Each person carried knowledge, kinship, memory, and obligation. A lost member meant a broken line inside the group. To recover the person, or at least recover the truth, was to repair the social world. But when a disappearance is joined to a mythic destination, the search can lose its human scale. Fawcett, Jack and Rimmel were fathers, sons, companions and travellers with tired bodies, not symbols placed there for later imagination. Yet the story around them kept enlarging. Newspapers, books, rumours and expedition plans turned their absence into an opening through which many desires could pass. Some wanted proof of death, some wanted proof of survival, some wanted a lost city, some wanted to test themselves against the same forest. The line between compassion and fascination became thin. This is why the search for a missing explorer can become a hunt for a legend. The first motive is personal. Someone has vanished. The second is historical. Perhaps the vanished person reached something unknown. The third is almost ancestral. The blank must not remain blank. Human beings do not rest easily beside unfinished signs. A footprint ending near water, A trail fading into dry leaves, a voice not heard again, these things have always demanded attention. In a small early community, such attention could save lives. In the Amazon mystery, it could also draw new people into old danger. Every searcher entered with a story already pressing on the senses. A broken branch might seem more meaningful. A village account might feel like confirmation. An object might become a clue before its context was understood. The legend trained the eye to expect revelation. Yet the forest remained a place of real people, real boundaries, and real risks, not a stage built to solve an outsider's question. It held lives already rooted there, with histories older than the expedition and meanings that did not depend on foreign maps. Even silence could be misread when listeners had already decided what kind of answer they wanted from the trees. The more the story was repeated, the easier it became to forget that the deepest loss was not the failure to find a city, but the disappearance of human beings into a space where evidence could no longer protect them from imagination. The search for Fawcett became a search for closure, and closure became confused with discovery. That confusion is what kept the mystery alive. It allowed the lost city to keep pulling at the living, not by proving itself, but by making every unanswered trace feel like the beginning of another path. A mystery can outlive the people who first carried it, because it moves from body to body, voice to voice, and generation to generation. After Fawcett vanished, the lost city was no longer only his destination. It became an inheritance of uncertainty. His son had gone with him, and that detail gave the story a painful human depth. The search was not merely a matter of one explorer disappearing into a forest. It was also the story of a family line interrupted, a father and a son fixed together in the same silence, and later generations left to imagine what had happened beyond the last reliable message. This is how some mysteries grow larger over time. They are not solved, so they become containers for new questions. Each generation receives the old absence and fills it with the tools, fears, and hopes of its own age. Early searchers looked with maps, guides, testimony, and the physical will to enter difficult country. Later readers looked through archives, photographs, interviews, and new ideas about Amazonian archaeology. Still later, people could look at satellite images, environmental patterns, and wider research on ancient landscapes. The methods changed, but the central blank remained. That blank gave the story its strange continuity. It allowed people born long after 1925 to feel as if the trail had not fully ended. In the deep past of humanity, memory itself worked this way. A warning could pass from elders to children long after the original danger had gone. A route could be remembered by people who never first discovered it. A place of loss could remain important because the story attached to it helped a community understand risk, boundary, and belonging. Human beings do not inherit only tools and genes. They inherit unfinished meanings. The lost city became one of those meanings. It passed from expedition records into popular imagination, from personal tragedy into cultural myth, from one era of exploration into another era of cautious science. But each transfer changed it. The more distant people became from the original event, the easier it was to polish the silence into a legend. The forest grew darker in the telling. The city became more definite in some versions, more magical in others, more symbolic in serious accounts. Fawcett himself became less like a tired man walking under heat, and more like a figure standing at the border between discovery and disappearance. This is what happens when a story crosses generations without a firm ending. It becomes layered. Some layers preserve real information, others preserve emotion, others preserve mistakes. The task is not to strip away wonder completely, but to keep wonder from pretending to be proof. A responsible telling can admit that later archaeology has changed how we think about Amazonia, while also admitting that it does not hand us Fawcett's city as a confirmed place. A responsible telling can feel the pull of the missing men without turning their unknown fate into a spectacle. The generational structure of the mystery matters because it shows how absence can become durable. A single vanished expedition might have faded if it had been separated from a larger question. A possible hidden city might have faded if no one had disappeared while searching for it. Together, they formed a story strong enough to cross time. It connected the ancient human habit of following traces with the modern habit of investigating archives and landscapes. It reminded each new listener that the past is not only what happened, but what remains unsettled in the minds of those who come after. The city may or may not have existed as Fawcett believed, but the search for it became real in another way. It shaped choices, journeys, books, fears, and imaginations long after the first searchers were gone. A place can swallow a body once, but an unanswered question can swallow attention for generations, again and again. A forest does not keep the past by freezing it in place. It keeps the past by changing it slowly, folding it into leaves, roots, water, insects, fungi, and soil. This is why the Amazon can feel less like a sealed archive and more like a living one. A stone ruin may stand still and wait for the eye. A tropical forest does not wait in the same way. It grows over what people leave behind. It breaks down wood, covers paths, softens raised ground, and turns abandoned clearings into new layers of green. Yet that does not mean the human trace is gone. It may remain as a different colour in the soil, a faint shape under vegetation, a line that seems too straight, a patch where useful trees gather more densely than chance alone would suggest. The forest hides by renewing itself. It erases the obvious while sometimes preserving the subtle. This slow transformation matters deeply to the story of the lost city. Searchers wanted a place that could be recognized as a destination. The forest offered instead a process. It did not say yes or no in a clean voice. It absorbed, covered, recycled, and rearranged. A house built from plant materials could vanish from sight, while the ground beneath it still remembered repeated fires, food waste, broken pottery, and human feet. A path used for generations could lose its open surface while still influencing the way plants returned. A settlement could become a pattern rather than a ruin. For people trained to look for hard evidence, that kind of survival can feel almost like disappearance. But for the long history of humanity, it is ordinary. Most human life has never been preserved as grand architecture. Our earliest ancestors moved through landscapes with tools, fire, shelter, memory, and shared attention. They left marks that were fragile from the beginning, ash scattered by wind, footprints taken by rain, branches bent back by growth, sleeping places abandoned when the season changed. What made those places human was not their ability to last forever. It was the fact that bodies had gathered there, rested there, learned there, feared there, and returned there. In the Amazon, the same principle becomes visible on a larger and slower scale. Human life may have shaped the land in ways that later became difficult to separate from nature, because people and environment were never fully separate in the first place. A garden can become forest again and still carry the memory of cultivation. A mound can soften and still hold intention. A dark soil can remain after the daily life that made it has disappeared. The forest, then, is not merely a cover placed over history. It is a participant in how history survives. It decides what becomes visible, what becomes chemical, what becomes botanical, and what becomes almost unreadable. This is why the lost city should not be imagined only as something hidden behind trees. It may be more accurate to imagine the entire landscape as a slow negotiation between human activity and natural return. Some traces stay, some dissolve. Some change form so completely that only patient methods can approach them. The same environment that could overwhelm an explorer's body could also protect old evidence from easy interpretation. Heat, rain, distance, and growth made the search exhausting, but they also made the past difficult to simplify. The forest did not preserve a neat answer for the people who wanted one. It preserved fragments, patterns, and silences. To listen to such a place, the mind has to become quieter than legend. It has to accept that the most important evidence may not rise like a wall, but sleep beneath roots, held in the dark patience of soil. Modern archaeology often begins by teaching the eye to distrust first impressions. In a forest, the surface can be misleading, because the newest growth is usually the most visible thing. A person walking on the ground may see trunks, vines, leaf litter, streams, and uneven earth, but not the older pattern underneath. To read that pattern, researchers use many kinds of patience. They study soil layers, pottery fragments, charcoal, pollen, plant distributions, and the shapes of landforms that may have been changed by human hands. In some places, remote sensing can help reveal lines, mounds, ditches, or geometric forms that are difficult to notice from below the canopy. These methods do not make the forest transparent. They only give the past more ways to speak. A faint rise can be measured. A dark earth deposit can be tested. A buried shard can be placed beside other evidence. A line in vegetation can become a question rather than a conclusion. This is important because the story of the lost city has often been pulled toward one dramatic expectation, that somewhere, hidden under leaves, there must be a single place waiting to prove everything. Careful archaeology moves differently. It does not ask the ground to become legend. It asks what human activity can be supported by evidence, and how each sign relates to the signs around it. A ditch may suggest water management, defense, boundary, or another function depending on where it lies and what is found near it. A mound may be natural, modified, lived on, buried in, or used in ways that changed over time. Useful trees may reflect long relationships between people and plants, but they have to be studied in context before memory can be separated from coincidence. The old human story began with exactly this kind of context, though without scientific instruments. Our ancestors survived because they read small differences in place: soil firm enough to walk on, plants returning after disturbance, animal paths bending toward water, smoke telling of other people, stars and landmarks helping memory hold a root. They did not live by isolated signs. They lived by relationships between signs. Modern archaeology, at its calmest, returns to that older discipline with better tools. It asks how a landscape was used repeatedly, where bodies gathered, where food was processed, where fire burned, where water was managed, where children may have learned the paths that adults already knew. In Amazonia, such questions can reveal histories that do not look like ruins in the usual sense. The past may appear as a distribution rather than a monument, as an arrangement of soils, plants, earthworks, ceramics, and movement corridors. This makes the search for a lost city both more grounded and less simple. It suggests that the most truthful answer may not be a single hidden wall, but a broader recognition that human life once shaped many places more deeply than earlier outsiders imagined. Still, every method has limits. Remote images can show shapes, but they do not alone explain who made them or when. Soil can preserve signs of use, but it needs careful dating and comparison. Pottery can mark human presence, but it does not automatically define the scale or meaning of a settlement. The slow work of evidence protects the story from becoming a fantasy wearing scientific language. It also protects the people of the past from being turned into props for a mystery. They were not clues placed for future explorers. They were human communities living within rivers, seasons, hunger, kinship, danger, and memory. Their traces deserve to be read with the same care that a living person deserves when speaking softly. Only then can the forest become more than a backdrop for disappearance, and more like a patient record of how human beings learned to make a home where later eyes from outside saw only distance, silence, green uncertainty, and shadow at night. The past does not always come back under bright light. Sometimes it returns slowly, almost reluctantly, through the quiet patience of earth. A handful of dark soil, a broken piece of pottery, a faint rise under grass, a curve in the land that does not quite belong to accident. These things do not feel like the opening of a great mystery at first. They feel small. They ask the listener to slow down. That is what makes the Amazon so different from the older image of lost cities in the human imagination. The forest does not offer history as a sudden door swinging open. It offers layers. Leaf fall becomes cover. Roots pass through old ground. Rain presses surfaces flat, then cuts them again. A place once cleared by hands may return to green, but the return is not simple erasure. It is more like a blanket drawn over a sleeping memory. To understand such a landscape, the mind has to give up the desire for immediate revelation. The most meaningful evidence may not appear as a wall, a gate, or a shining object. It may appear as a difference so quiet that only careful comparison makes it visible. This slower kind of history is closer to the beginning of human life than many people realize. Our earliest ancestors did not move through the world leaving monuments behind them. They left repeated use. They left hearths, paths, tool fragments, altered places, and memories carried by living voices. A campsite could matter greatly to a group and still disappear almost completely after enough rain, wind, growth, and time. What made it human was not permanence. It was attention, return, and shared meaning. In the Amazon, the same truth becomes larger and more difficult. A whole human landscape can be present without behaving like the ruins people expect. A garden can become forest. A route can become a line of plant differences. A settlement can become soil, pottery, and shape. The story of the lost city becomes calmer when seen in this light. It is not a race toward one spectacular answer. It is an invitation to ask how human beings become part of a place deeply enough that even after their buildings decay, the land still carries some trace of their choices. That trace may be humble, but humility does not make it weak. In fact, it may be the only honest form in which much of the past survives. The searchers who wanted a single hidden city were drawn toward a clear picture. They wanted the forest to resolve itself into a destination. Yet the older human past often resists such resolution. It is distributed through water, soil, plants, paths, and the remains of ordinary acts. People cooked, slept, planted, repaired, buried, carried children. These acts are not less historical than the building of stone walls. They are the foundation from which all later forms of human life grew. The calm lesson of archaeology is that history can be real, even when it is quiet. It does not need to rise loudly from the ground to matter. It can wait below leaves, not as a secret treasure, but as a patient record of lives once adjusted to a difficult world. This is why the Amazon should not be treated as a dark stage built only for disappearance. It is also a keeper of slow evidence. It reminds us that the human story is often found not where imagination points first, but where careful attention finally learns to rest. The lost city, whether it was a mistaken dream, an exaggerated echo, or a memory of wider human landscapes, belongs to that slower rhythm. It asks us to listen beneath the legend, beneath the excitement, beneath the wish for a simple answer. Under the forest floor, history may not be shouting at all. It may be breathing in layers, waiting for people patient enough to hear it. A legend does not become evidence simply because it survives for a long time. It becomes a record of what people believed, feared, wanted, repeated, or misunderstood. That distinction is the calm center of the lost city story. Around Fawcett and Zed, there are at least 3 different layers that must not be blended too quickly. The first is legend, the old human tendency to turn distance into meaning, to place a hidden center beyond the known road, to imagine that a forest, desert, mountain, or sea must be protecting something. The second is the record of exploration, letters, routes, reports, maps, testimony, and the real disappearance of people who entered the Amazon with a goal in mind. The third is archaeological evidence, soil, ceramics, earthworks, plant patterns, dates, and physical traces that can be studied without needing the legend to be true in its most dramatic form. Each layer matters, but each layer answers a different question. Legend tells us how people imagined the unknown. Exploration tells us what certain travelers believed and attempted. Archaeology tells us what the ground can support. Trouble begins when one layer is forced to do the work of another. A rumor cannot prove a city. A map cannot prove what lies beyond its uncertainty. A dark soil deposit cannot prove the exact destination of an expedition. Yet none of these things should be dismissed without thought, because each may preserve a different kind of human information. This is close to the beginning of our species. Early people lived by reading uncertain signs, but they also lived by sharing stories around those signs. A place where water had once been found could become a remembered route. A place of danger could become a warning. A distant group could become a story told long after direct contact faded. Human memory was never a perfect recording device. It was a survival tool, shaped by usefulness, fear, repetition, and the need to guide others. That is why legend can carry traces of real experience while still changing the shape of what happened. The story of a hidden city may preserve a sense that the Amazon had older human landscapes, but it may also compress many places, many communities, and many misunderstandings into one powerful image. The exploration record has its own limits. Fawcett's training, travels, and confidence make his search historically important, but they do not turn his conclusion into proof. A person can be observant and still mistaken. A person can be right that a region has been underestimated and still wrong about the exact object being sought. That is not a contradiction. It is one of the most ordinary conditions of human knowledge. Archaeology, by contrast, moves slowly because it has to let evidence resist desire. It asks whether a feature is natural or modified, whether pottery belongs to one period or another, whether soil chemistry reflects repeated human life, whether an earthwork was used for dwelling, defense, ceremony, water control, or something not yet understood. These questions are less dramatic than the image of explorers vanishing before a lost city, but they are more trustworthy. They protect the dead from being used as decoration for a mystery, and they protect the living from inheriting a false conclusion. They also return attention to the people who actually lived in the forest, not as shadows around an explorer's dream, but as communities with their own histories, choices, losses, and forms of knowledge. When these layers are kept separate, the story becomes more honest and more interesting. Z may be a legend in the form Fawcett imagined. Fawcett's disappearance may be a historical event without a final explanation. Amazonian archaeology may reveal complex human landscapes without confirming the exact city he sought. Held together carefully, these truths do not weaken the mystery. They make it deeper, because they show how human beings turn absence into story, story into search, and search, sometimes, into evidence that answers a different question than the one first asked. Science does not have to prove a legend completely true before the legend becomes useful. It only has to ask why the legend was believable, what kind of world allowed it to grow, and which pieces of it touch evidence that can be tested. This is a quieter way to understand the lost city. If the goal is only to decide whether Fawcett Z stood exactly as he imagined it, the story may end in frustration. The proof is not there. But if the goal is to understand why an experienced surveyor could believe the Amazon had been misunderstood, then the story opens into something more valuable. A legend can be wrong in its shape and still point toward a real historical problem. For a long time, outsiders underestimated the depth and variety of human life in Amazonia. They often expected ancient complexity to look like stone ruins, written records, and visible monuments. When the forest did not offer those signs easily, they mistook difficulty for absence. The legend of Z did not correct that mistake by itself, but it kept attention fixed on a question that later research would approach more carefully. What kinds of societies had lived in the forest, and what kinds of traces had they left behind? This is how science can learn from a story without surrendering to it. The story provides a question. Evidence decides how far the answer can go. Human beings have always lived between question and evidence. At the beginning of our species, no one waited for perfect knowledge before moving. A group noticed tracks, clouds, water sounds, or the memory of fruiting trees, and then judged the risk. Those judgments were not fantasies. They were educated guesses made by bodies that needed to survive. But if a guess was repeated too confidently, it could become dangerous. The same is true in history. A rumor of a city can invite investigation, but it cannot replace excavation, dating, comparison, and careful listening to local knowledge. The value of the rumor is not that it proves itself. Its value is that it may reveal where human curiosity has been directed, where ignorance has been protected by distance, and where older assumptions deserve to be questioned. In the Amazon, modern research has shown that the old image of untouched emptiness was too simple. Evidence from soils, ceramics, earthworks, plant management, and settlement patterns has helped build a richer picture of human presence in many places. That wider picture does not hand us Z as a finished answer. It teaches a different lesson. A legend may be a distorted echo of a larger truth. It may gather many memories into one imagined center. It may compress landscapes, communities, and generations into a single name because the human mind prefers a clear object to a wide pattern. Science must then do what legend cannot do. It must slow the image down. It must ask which trace belongs to which place, which date belongs to which layer, which interpretation is supported, and which remains only possible. This restraint is not a weakness. It is the way knowledge stays honest. It also protects the people of the past from being turned into ornaments around an explorer's dream. They were not evidence waiting for Fawcett. They were human communities living within their own worlds, with their own roots, foods, conflicts, rituals, losses, and forms of memory. The first human landscapes were built from ordinary needs before they were ever named by outsiders. That is why the most important lesson from the legend may not be the existence of one hidden city. It may be the need to look again at places that earlier eyes misunderstood. A legend can invite the question. Science must decide what the ground can truly bear. The most honest possibility may also be the least satisfying to the mind. Z may not have been one city at all. It may have been a shadow made from several kinds of truth laid over one another until they looked, from a distance, like a single hidden place. There may have been real indigenous accounts of old settlements, real memories of inhabited landscapes, real signs of earth shaped by human labour, real misunderstandings in translation, and real desire from outsiders who wanted the unknown to gather itself into one dramatic centre. When these things travel together, they can become stronger than any one of them could be alone. A name begins to behave like a location. A rumour begins to behave like a route. A region of many human histories begins to behave like a lost capital waiting for discovery. This does not make the story worthless. It makes it human. Our species has always carried memory in compressed forms. Long before writing, people remembered dangerous places, useful waters, fruiting trees, old camps, and the movements of other groups through stories that could be repeated. A story did not need to preserve every detail to preserve something important. It could bend, simplify, and still carry a warning or a memory of place. But once stories pass through unfamiliar languages, colonial expectations, personal ambition, and the need for wonder, they can change shape until the original ground becomes difficult to see. Z may belong to that difficult family of memories. It may be an echo of many places rather than the name of one. It may point toward a real truth about Amazonia without matching the architectural picture imagined by Fawcett. This is a quieter answer, but perhaps a more responsible one. The Amazon was not empty, and many older views of it were too narrow. Yet the correction to that error should not become a new exaggeration. A network of villages, managed forests, earthworks, roots, and cultivated soils is not less meaningful than a lost city simply because it is harder to summarize. In fact, it may be closer to the way human life actually develops in many environments. People begin with bodies needing water, food, rest, safety, and kin. They return to useful ground. They alter it slowly. They teach children where to go and what to avoid. Over generations, those acts become a human landscape. Later, someone from outside may see only trees and distance, or may hear one story and imagine towers behind the leaves. Both reactions miss the slower reality. The human past is often not a single object hidden under nature, but a relationship between people and place that has changed through time. If Z was a shadow of many memories, then the explorers were not simply searching for the wrong place. They were searching for the wrong shape of certainty. They wanted a point where the map could stop wandering. They wanted scattered hints to become one answer. That desire is understandable because the mind rests more easily on a name than on a web of relationships. But archaeology often leads away from simple names and back toward patient patterns. It asks where soil changed, where people gathered, where water was managed, where paths connected lives, where plants show long care, and where memory may have survived in forms that do not look like monuments. Seen this way, the lost city becomes less like a treasure buried in the forest, and more like a lesson about how easily human evidence can be narrowed by expectation. The forest may have swallowed explorers, but it also swallowed categories that were too rigid to hold its past. Perhaps there was no single Z waiting at the end of the path. Perhaps there were many human worlds, some remembered, some damaged, some hidden in soil and plant life, all too wide to fit inside one seductive name. The deeper loss in the story of the lost city is not only the disappearance of explorers, it is the disappearance of many human histories that were never given the same attention. Fawcett's silence became famous because it entered newspapers, books, archives, and the imagination of people far from the Amazon. His absence was recorded, repeated, investigated, and turned into a question that could travel across the world. But long before and long after his expedition, other losses had taken place in the same broad region with far less recognition. Indigenous communities across the Americas endured disease, violence, forced movement, enslavement, missionization, land seizure, and the pressure of outside economies. These forces did not erase everyone, and they did not erase every memory, but they damaged many lines through which memory might have passed. A village can be burned, abandoned, or moved. A language can lose speakers. A route can stop being used. A burial place can become unknown to outsiders, or known only in a guarded way. A story can survive in one family while disappearing from written records. When later searchers looked for a lost city, they were often entering a landscape where the greater loss was not hidden treasure, but interrupted continuity. This is a colder thought than the legend itself. A single missing expedition can be mourned in a clear way because names and dates remain attached to it. The loss of many communities, many places, and many remembered paths is harder to hold because it is spread across generations and often survives only in fragments. Yet this wider loss is central to the question. If older Amazonian societies left earthworks, dark soils, managed forests, pottery, and settlement traces, then the people who made them were not shadows waiting to be discovered by outsiders. They were human beings, living within their own worlds, raising children, adapting to rivers, protecting knowledge, and changing land through repeated use. This connects directly to the earliest beginning of humanity. From the first small groups, human life depended on continuity. Elders teaching the young where water could be found, which plants could be trusted, where danger gathered, and how to return home. Culture was not a decoration added later. It was a survival system passed through bodies, voices, habits, and remembered ground. When disease or violence breaks a community, it breaks more than population. It can break the chain that tells a place what it has meant. This is why the idea of a swallowed city must be widened. What was swallowed may not have been only 3 searchers in 1925, or even one possible ancient settlement beneath trees. It may have been the recognition of whole human landscapes whose own explanations were weakened before outsiders began asking their questions. Colonial records often noticed what served colonial needs: labour, territory, conflict, conversion, resources, roots. They did not always preserve the inner meanings of a place, the names used by local people, the histories told at night, or the quiet knowledge of gardens, fishing grounds, and old dwelling areas. Absence in archives, therefore, is not the same as absence in life. A place may be poorly recorded because the people recording it did not care to understand it, or because the people who understood it had good reason not to hand over everything they knew. The lost city legend can become misleading when it places the outsider at the centre and makes the forest seem important only because someone from outside vanished there. A more honest view reverses the direction of attention. The Amazon was already filled with human meanings before Fawcett named his goal. Its rivers were already roots. Its soils already carried histories. Its communities already had memories, boundaries, griefs, and forms of knowledge. The tragedy is not only that a searcher disappeared while looking for a hidden past. It is that so much visible and living human presence had to be ignored before the hidden past could appear mysterious to outsiders. The forest did not swallow history by itself. Time, decay, disease, violence, misunderstanding, and unequal power all helped make the past harder to hear. A more careful story begins when the forest stops being treated as scenery and becomes a homeland. The Amazon was not a dark, empty stage waiting for an explorer to enter, suffer, vanish, and make it meaningful. It was already meaningful to the people whose families knew its rivers, seasons, dangerous crossings, useful plants, fishing places, burial grounds, and social boundaries. To speak only of outsiders who disappeared is to make the oldest mistake in another form. It turns a lived world into a background for someone else's longing. The lost city then becomes less a question about human history and more a mirror reflecting the desires of the searcher. A responsible telling has to shift the weight back toward the people of the place. Their knowledge was not decoration around the mystery, it was a long human achievement. To know a wet forest well enough to live there across generations means reading water levels, animal behavior, soil, weather, plant cycles, and neighboring communities with a patience no distant map can replace. This is close to the root of humanity itself. The first human worlds were not made by conquest or fame. They were made by repeated care, remembering where children could sleep safely, where food returned, where the body could rest, and where a path should not be taken. In that sense, indigenous knowledge of Amazonian landscapes belongs to the same deep human tradition as any ancient road, farm, or settlement. It turns space into memory, and memory into survival. When outsiders ignored that knowledge, they did not simply miss information. They misunderstood the moral shape of the landscape. A river was not only a route into the unknown, it might be a boundary, a food source, a storyline, a place of grief, or a corridor between communities. A clearing was not only a possible clue, it might be a garden, a former home, a place kept quiet for reasons outsiders had no right to demand. Even silence from local people can be misread if the listener assumes every place should reveal itself to foreign curiosity. Some knowledge is protected because it is sacred, vulnerable, or bound to relationships. Some knowledge is withheld because history has made disclosure dangerous. The Lost City story becomes more honest when it admits this. The question is not only whether explorers found what they wanted, it is also what their search failed to respect. The search for Z carried a belief that the Amazon held a deeper past, and that belief, in a broad sense, was not empty. But the way the story has often been told places the outsider's disappearance above the ongoing presence of people who were never lost. This changes how the title should be heard. If a city swallowed explorers, perhaps part of what swallowed them was the assumption that the forest existed to answer their question. A place already full of meanings cannot be reduced to a puzzle. It has its own histories, not all of them available to strangers. This is especially important because many communities still live with the consequences of older searches, older violence, and older stories told without their voices near the center. Human origins remind us why this matters. Every community begins with bodies depending on one another, on land, on learned roots, on trust. To erase that dependency from the story is to erase the very foundation of human life. The educational value of the Lost City is therefore not to glorify danger or turn disappearance into spectacle. It is to teach humility before inhabited landscapes. A mystery may invite attention, but attention must not become possession. Wonder becomes safer when it learns to bow before evidence, people, and place. The forest was not empty before the search, and it did not become important because explorers vanished there. It was and remains a human place as well as a living one. When a culture disappears from paperwork, it has not disappeared from history. It has only disappeared from the kind of record that later powers learned to trust. This is one of the quietest lessons behind the Lost City. Written documents can feel solid because they give dates, names, signatures, routes, and official language. Yet paper has never held the whole human past. Many lives were never written down by the people who lived them, and many written accounts were made by outsiders who saw only what their own purposes allowed them to see. A village might not appear in an archive and still have been full of births, deaths, gardens, meals, songs, grief, arguments, repairs, and remembered paths. A language might not be printed and still carry generations of knowledge about rivers, seasons, animals, and the moral boundaries of land. A place might be missing from a colonial map and still be known deeply by those who walked it every day. The beginning of humanity was not documented by ink. It was carried in bodies, habits, tools, fire, footsteps, and memory. Long before states kept records, human groups knew where to go because elders remembered. Children learned not from documents but from voices, watching hands, shared hunger, and repeated return. That older form of knowledge was real, even when it left no written proof. This matters when thinking about Amazonia, because the loss of written visibility can be mistaken for the loss of existence itself. When outside records fail to name a community, the failure may belong to the record, not to the community. When later history cannot easily reconstruct a settlement, the difficulty may come from disease, violence, displacement, material decay, or the narrow attention of observers who did not understand what they were seeing. Across the world, many societies have lived more fully in land, memory, and practice than in archives. Their absence from official pages does not make them shadows. It shows how unevenly history preserves human life. The search for a lost city becomes more meaningful when placed beside this wider truth. People were willing to imagine one hidden place of great importance, yet many real places of human importance had already been overlooked because they did not fit the expected form. A stone ruin commands attention. A living forest garden may not. An inscription speaks in a way outsiders value. A careful planting pattern, a sacred quiet place, or a route taught across generations may speak only to those who know its language. The mistake is to think silence means nothing happened. Silence may mean that the wrong listener arrived, or that the voice was damaged before it could be heard. Human origins remind us that culture begins wherever people learn together how to survive, remember, and belong. It does not require monuments to become real. It requires continuity. When continuity is broken, later centuries may see only fragments and call them mystery, but a fragment can still point toward a whole life. A pottery shard is not the meal, yet it tells us hands once held a vessel. Dark soil is not the household, yet it may hold the residue of repeated living. A forgotten path is not the conversation that once moved along it, yet it marks direction, return, and purpose. In world history, many people have been made invisible not because they were unimportant, but because the systems that recorded importance were unequal. The lost city, then, should not teach only fascination with disappearance. It should teach caution before declaring absence. It should ask the listener to respect the difference between what is unknown and what never existed. The forest may keep many answers beyond reach, yet the lack of a complete record is not an empty verdict. It is an invitation to listen more carefully, to let evidence remain patient, and to remember that human life has always been wider than the documents that survive it. By the time the story reaches its quiet edge, the map no longer feels like a promise. It feels like a human attempt to hold more certainty than the world is willing to give. Maps are among the most powerful objects human beings have ever made, not because they are always right, but because they make distance look understandable. A river becomes a line, a forest becomes a colour, a mountain range becomes a shape with a name. A dangerous journey becomes something the eye can cross in a moment. Yet the ground itself remains larger than the drawing. It holds mud, heat, illness, memory, boundaries, homes, graves, old paths, and living people whose knowledge may never fit inside the printed surface. The Lost City story is a reminder that a map can guide the body and mislead the mind at the same time. Fawcett trusted maps, but he also knew they were incomplete. That knowledge made him alert to hidden possibilities, and perhaps also vulnerable to them. He understood that official certainty could be thin, that wide regions might be named without being truly understood, and that the Amazon held histories outsiders had not learned to read. In that broad caution, he was not simply wrong. But a useful doubt can become dangerous when it begins to harden into a single destination. The human past often resists that kind of narrowing. Memory can fade, move, merge, and survive in damaged forms. A story about one place may carry echoes from many places. A name may gather several landscapes under one sound. A route may be remembered after the reason for it has changed. From the beginning of humanity, memory has never been a perfect container. It is a living tool. It protects what people need, reshapes what they fear, and sometimes loses what later generations most want to know. That is why traces in the ground can be more patient than stories, even when they are smaller. Soil does not explain itself, but it may hold signs after voices are gone. Pottery does not tell the full life of a household, but it may remain when names disappear. A mound, a ditch, a pattern of trees, or a patch of darkened earth may survive the fading of speech and the breaking of records. These traces do not give easy comfort. They rarely say exactly what legend wants them to say, but they remind us that human life can leave evidence in forms quieter than glory. The search for Z becomes most honest when it is allowed to rest between map, memory, and material trace. The map shows desire organized into direction. Memory shows experience carried across time, altered by each passage. The ground shows what can still be tested, though never without patience. None of these alone is enough. Together, they teach humility. A wrong map may still point toward a real problem. A blurred memory may still preserve a fragment of truth. A small trace may outlast a confident claim. The Amazon does not need to reveal a lost capital to prove that human beings shaped it. It does not need to answer Fawcett exactly in order to challenge the older image of emptiness. The deeper lesson is that history is often strongest where certainty is weakest. Our species began with bodies moving through unknown places, reading signs, sharing warnings, and learning that survival depended on careful attention. That inheritance remains with us. We still follow lines, stories, and traces. We still want the blank space to speak clearly, but the past may answer only in fragments, and the first act of wisdom is to let those fragments remain honest. Humility is not a weak way to approach the past. It is the only way that keeps the past from being turned into something it never was. The Lost City story teaches this slowly, because every path through it tempts the mind toward a stronger claim than the evidence can carry. It is tempting to say the city existed exactly as imagined. It is also tempting to say it was nothing at all, only fantasy, only error, only a vanished dream of exploration. Both answers are too easy. The careful answer stands in the middle and accepts discomfort. There were real journeys, real disappearances, real indigenous histories, real archaeological traces across parts of Amazonia, and real limits to what can be known. None of those truths needs to swallow the others. A mature understanding lets each one remain in its place. That is a valuable lesson far beyond one forest or one expedition. Human beings have always wanted certainty because certainty helps the body feel safe. In the beginning of our species, uncertainty was not an intellectual problem. It was hunger, weather, distance, injury, and the possibility of not finding the way back. To live, people had to make judgments before all facts were present. They followed tracks, remembered water, trusted elders, and told stories that helped the group move through danger. That ancient need for usable knowledge still lives in the modern mind. It is why mysteries pull so strongly. They promise that the blank place can be filled, the missing route recovered, the silence given a name. But history does not exist to calm the mind by force. It asks for a different kind of rest, one that comes from accepting the weight of evidence without demanding more from it than it can honestly give. When evidence is incomplete, the honest sentence often contains words like perhaps, may, likely, possible, and unknown. These words can feel unsatisfying, but they protect truth. They leave room for future discoveries. They prevent the dead from being used to decorate a story, and they prevent living communities from being reduced to scenery around someone else's question. In Amazonia, humility means recognizing that outsiders once underestimated the depth of human presence there. It also means not replacing that mistake with a new certainty about every legend. The forest can hold human-shaped landscapes without confirming every imagined city. It can preserve traces while withholding a final picture. It can challenge old assumptions without turning uncertainty into proof. This balance is what makes the story useful for a listener, not merely mysterious. It teaches how knowledge should breathe. Too much doubt can erase real human lives. Too much belief can invent what the ground has not said. Between them is careful attention. That attention belongs to archaeology, to history, and also to the oldest human habits of survival. Our ancestors had to listen closely to the world because their lives depended on not confusing hope with sign or fear with fact. A broken branch might matter, but not every broken branch meant danger. A distant smoke column might mean people, but not always enemies. The skill was not only noticing, it was judging slowly, with patience, memory, and humility. The Lost City asks for the same skill. It asks us to notice the traces of Amazonian human life, the tragedy of disappearance, the power of story, and the limits of evidence, without forcing them into a single, easy answer. That is the educational value at the center of the mystery. The past is not an object to conquer. It is a relationship to enter with care. The more incomplete the record, the more responsible the listener must become. If there is peace in this story, it is not the peace of solving everything. It is the quieter peace of learning how to stand before what remains unknown without filling the silence too quickly or too confidently. Perhaps the Lost City remains powerful because it refuses to become only one thing. It may have been a mistake shaped by longing. It may have been an exaggerated echo of several real places. It may have been a question that pointed toward a wider truth about Amazonia. even while failing to name it correctly. It may also remain unreachable in a simpler way, not because it is magical, but because time, rain, disease, violence, decay, and silence have changed the evidence beyond easy recovery. Each possibility carries its own weight, and none should be forced into certainty for the sake of a stronger ending. The safest final thought is not that the city was found, or that it never mattered. The safest thought is that the search revealed something larger than itself. Human beings are creatures who follow traces. We were shaped by landscapes where survival depended on noticing what was incomplete: a track in mud, a distant sound of water, a remembered tree, a smoke line beyond the ridge, a route taught by someone older. From those small signs came movement, memory, and eventually history. But the same gift that helps us read the world can also make us impatient with what remains unreadable. We want the forest to answer. We want the missing men to return as a complete story. We want the ancient communities of Amazonia to appear in forms our eyes immediately understand. Yet the past does not owe us that kind of clarity. It gives fragments, and asks whether we can treat them with care. In the story of Fawcett, Jack, and Rimmel, the human cost is real, even if the final explanation is not. In the wider story of Amazonia, the human presence is real, even where old records ignored it or materials decayed back into the forest. In the deepest story of our species, the lesson is real as well. People do not enter history only when they build monuments that survive. They enter history when they live, adapt, remember, teach, lose, return, and leave even the faintest mark on the ground around them. A quiet trace can be enough to say that a life passed there. A dark soil, a shard, a path, a story, a changed stand of trees. These are not dramatic endings, but they are human. The lost city, then, should leave us not with triumph, but with humility. It should teach that wonder is safest when it walks beside evidence. It should teach that uncertainty is not failure when honesty is preserved. It should teach that inhabited landscapes deserve respect before they are turned into mysteries for distant eyes. And it should teach that disappearance has many forms. A body can disappear into distance. A settlement can disappear into soil. A people can disappear from a document while remaining present in descendants, land, memory, and traces still being read. This lesson matters because every human origin story begins with vulnerability. No group survived by imagination alone, and no group survived by evidence alone. They survived by holding both carefully. Enough hope to move forward, enough caution to avoid turning hope into danger. That balance is still needed whenever we face an unfinished past. Perhaps this is why the title continues to feel unsettling. The city that swallowed every explorer may not be a monster hidden under leaves. It may be the name we give to the place where human curiosity meets the limits of its own knowledge. It may be the border between the need to know and the duty not to invent. It may be the forest asking us to slow down, to listen, and to admit that some regions of the human story must be approached gently, without conquest. So when the night grows quiet, and the image of the green interior returns, the final question is not only whether a lost city still waits beneath the trees, it is whether we can learn to honor a past that may never give itself completely to us.